For the longest time, I was one of those people that just didn't understand the hype around Linux. I thought it was a disappointing, overrated operating system that couldn't do much, and that a lot of people were using, frankly, just to be contrarian. At one point, I was even considering making a video sharing these sentiments, but held off, mostly because it would have been an opinion-based video rather than one based on a lot of research. I just didn't really like Linux. But then I had a Linux server installed in my workstation recently, and wow, I couldn't have been more wrong. I get it. You won. All right? I've been converted. I like Linux now. Not only that, I use it every day, and frankly, couldn't live without it. Having said that, I still understand why people would have the feelings about Linux that I initially had. But the burning question is, why? Linux is an operating system that is constantly being improved, updated, and secured by some of the most talented and experienced programmers on the internet. Additionally, there are so many versions of the OS to choose from. Its hardware requirements are super flexible, and the best part, it is completely free to download and use. This sounds like the dream OS to use, a no-brainer for your computer. Now, I do want to acknowledge the nuance that the vast majority of computer servers and mainframes do in fact run Linux, a staggering 90% in fact, but the consumer market tells a totally different story. As of now, Linux only accounts for around 3% of PC market share. The servers that run the cloud service you're paying for are most certainly using Linux, but your grandmother with her laptop, she's probably never even heard of it. What is going on here? Why didn't this OS see the same kind of success that, say, the World Wide Web did when making its decision to essentially become a public domain project? Why does nobody use Linux? Answering this question requires some historical context, as well as detailing how the OS was even developed in the first place. The thing that's important to keep in mind is that we typically call Linux an OS semantically. However, it is technically not an OS, but instead a kernel. Think of the kernel as basically the brain of the operating system, the section that instructs all the processes on how they are supposed to behave. But for simplicity's sake, any operating systems that use this Linux kernel are usually just referred to as Linux anyway. The exact reason for this all starts with the kernel's origins, which technically begin all the way back in 1964. Yes, while the Ford Mustang was being unveiled at the World's Fair and the Beatles were taking over America, a group of New Jersey researchers at Bell Labs were working on a big project. You see, Bell Labs was running into a big bottleneck when it came to productivity: time. These large mainframes were only capable of allowing one person to work on them at a time. If another person wanted to work with the machines at the same time, they just had to wait their turn. The computer's software just wasn't powerful enough yet. But these researchers realized it didn't have to be this way. Instead, they could set up their workstation to use something called a time-sharing operating system. This is a system that allows multiple people to access the same mainframe at once, by essentially dividing up the machine's CPU power, memory, and even its peripherals based on the activities of each user, rather than having all the resources just dedicated to one user. Otherwise, if another user tried to log on, the entire system would crash. This division is done through something called time slicing. Basically, the system allocates its resources to each logged-in user for incredibly brief moments. And it does this so rapidly, it creates the illusion that 4 people are using the machine at the same time. There aren't 4 Beatles, it's just Ringo moving really fast. A time-sharing OS behaves in the same way. This system that Bell Labs was working on was called Multics, short for Multiplexed Information and Computing System. And it was meant to be a much more robust and stronger version of the already existing time-sharing systems that was specifically tailored for Bell Labs' needs. However, the specific technology for what they needed wasn't exactly there yet. The project got way too ambitious and expensive, so it was ultimately discontinued by 1969. However, One of these developers named Ken Thompson saw an opportunity. During this time, he had created his own video game called Space Travel, which was initially made specifically for the Multics platform. But he wanted to continue playing this game, and playing it on a Multics machine was actually quite costly. What if he could move the game over to a much more portable, economical machine? He decided to port it to the PDP-7, and with the help of Dennis Ritchie, essentially had to create his own version of Multics to do so, a much more flexible, lightweight version of it. Unlike Multics, this OS was a single-tasked system, so he called it the punny Uniplexed Information and Computing System, or UNIX for short. The spelling of this was then changed to Unix with an X, and interestingly, nobody knows why. The origins behind this name change are lost to history. Now you might be thinking to yourself, if the entire point of Multics development was to have this multitask setup, which Unix didn't have, then what exactly made Unix so special? First off, Unix did eventually support multitasking, despite keeping its original name. But what made it so special at its initial launch was that it showed that a well-designed, more than capable OS didn't have to be this bloated, hardware-intensive environment. It could be lightweight, simple, and work efficiently on all kinds of hardware, while using little power in the process. Additionally, it treated, quote, everything as a file. In simplified terms, it took the parts of a computer that weren't files, but formatted and showed them to the user as if they were, making it much easier for these users to configure them. It's the same reason why the iPhone was so revolutionary. It took your phone, your notebook, your radio, and your TV, and put it all on one device. Unix essentially did the same thing, but with all the components that make up your computer, putting them all in one uniform and simplified place. And so, Unix was eventually released in 1969, and a new revolution in computing was born. Now, what does this have to do with Linux? Well, think of Linux as the cousin of Unix, and its creator ran into very similar problems that the creators of Unix did. In 1991, Linus Torvalds, a student at the University of Helsinki in Finland, wanted a Unix, or at least Unix-like, system for his computer, but he couldn't afford it. The systems that were available were expensive, and the Unix source code itself was closed off, outside of specific academic exceptions. It was a proprietary, copyrighted work by AT&T. Linus couldn't just directly copy Unix, so what did he do? Well, he created an operating system that very closely resembled the approach and philosophies to computing that Unix had. After all, it was only the Unix code that was copyrighted, not the principles and abstract ideas of the OS itself. He initially called the OS Freaks by combining the words free, freak, and Unix. However, this was changed by a friend without his knowledge, who combined his name Linus and Unix, and so Linux was born. As interesting of a workaround to Unix this was, Linux was not the first to do it. AT&T's firm grasp on its Unix technology dates as far back as 1983, and it was strong enough even then to make a man named Richard Stallman want to do something about it. His goal was also to create an operating system that was Unix-like, while not infringing on copyright. In fact, he even gave it a cheeky name highlighting this. He called the project GNU, which is a recursive acronym for GNU's Not Unix. The project began essentially creating open source versions of popular Unix applications. Because there are tons of Unix applications, making free versions of each of them was going to be very ambitious. And so they did this over the course of many years through something called the General Public License. This meant that anyone could use, share, or modify the software as long as they publicly disclosed their modifications and distributed them under the same license. This allowed for GNU to become a huge community-driven effort, with amazing contributions being made to it by thousands of programmers that helped make it an incredible collection of open-source Unix-like software. But there was one problem with it. GNU didn't have a kernel. This meant that it was, again, technically just a collection of software. You could still run this free software on proprietary UNIX systems, but it wasn't technically an OS, like Stallman initially had in mind. The project was working on its own kernel called Herd, but because of creative differences among the community, overly ambitious ideas, empty promises, perfectionism, and even a fundamentally flawed foundation of the project itself, it never truly came to fruition. Linux, on the other hand, wasn't trying to be a whole lot, other than good enough. In fact, Linus's first post about Linux is very nonchalant and even a little self-deprecating. He was also very open to feedback and community contribution, which allowed it to inadvertently become the kernel that GNU wanted. But Linux didn't have these operating system utilities, and GNU did. In other words, Linux had the kernel, and GNU had the software. This was the perfect opportunity for mutualism, and when combining the two projects, you finally had what could be considered the first widely adopted, truly open source operating system, GNU Linux, or just Linux, which has become a semantic debate among many passionate users over the past few decades. It even has a mascot, a cute little penguin named Tux. Torvalds chose this after being bitten by a penguin at the zoo, and Tux is short for Torvalds Unix. So, Linux started garnering tons of contributions from thousands of well-versed developers all around the world. And it is this voluntary, non-commercially incentivized work that has arguably made Linux one of the most robust, flexible, and safe systems out there. These people wanted nothing more than to just make the computer that was truly democratic and personal. But by the late 1990s, Linux was in need of a good desktop environment. You know, a system that has folders, icons, a cursor you can point and click to do things, a GUI. During its early development, Linux was primarily a command line based environment. Think of the old school Apple II kind of systems. Now, there certainly were desktop environments and window managers that already existed by the end of the 90s, such as KDE, FEWM, TWM, and so on. However, there were a few problems. One of the most popular environments at the time, KDE, ironically was using a license for its Qt toolkit that wasn't fully open source. So it made things a bit more limiting for its development. Much like how GNU came to be, someone wanted to make an environment that was completely separated from any proprietary work. But not only that, people also wanted an environment that was a little bit more user-friendly. KDE was great for personal customizability and configuration, but it was very complicated and primarily designed for people who already knew what they were doing, rather than people getting into Linux or even computers altogether for the very first time. So in 1997, Miguel de Icaza and Frederico Mina created the GNU Network Object Model Environment, or GNOME, which is pronounced GNOME in the Linux community. One of the most popular open source software companies for Linux, known as Red Hat, just so happened to really like the GNOME project and gave it a ton of funding. When combining all these factors, this allowed for GNOME to develop very quickly and gain a lot of exposure as the environment of choice for a lot of people who began using Linux. Now, of course, a lot has changed since the 90s, and environments like KDE arguably share a lot more in common with GNOME, not to mention that there are even more environments to choose from today. So now, choosing between different environment types really is a matter of preference at the end of the day, each one having very passionate members in their respective communities. But this long-term exposure and funding has helped make GNOME remain the most popular environment of choice. And with all these choices came the rapid development of so many Linux-based operating systems to choose from, around 600 of them that are actively worked on. These are called Linux distros, or flavors, and some of the most popular include Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, Linux Mint, Arch, and so much more. Each of them are designed for different users with different needs and prefer different environments, but they also share this incredible kernel in common. But with all this customizability, all these options to choose from, constant surveillance and updating, and the fact that it is free, why does only 3% of the consumer PC market use Linux? Well, there's a few reasons for this. And it all has to do with the lack of public exposure, mainstream software support, or even viable freeware alternatives for a lot of proprietary products. And these factors are cyclical. The reason a lot of popular programs aren't on Linux is because Linux isn't very publicly available. And the reason Linux isn't very publicly available is because there's not a lot of software support for it. So the question is, why would someone want to spend $150 on Windows in the first place when there is a free alternative? Well, because most people aren't paying for Windows. They are purchasing computers that already have Windows pre-installed on them. And if PC manufacturers have the choice between pre-installing a free OS or being paid by Microsoft to use Windows instead, which option do you think they're going to choose? Naturally, with the majority of PC users who aren't very tech savvy, just buying a PC with Windows or Mac OS already on it, they're most likely not gonna know how to install another OS like Linux on it, nor are they going to care to learn how. And that fraction of people who do pay for a Windows license are doing it for this familiarity and for support for certain programs that they need. With Windows having a significant hold on the consumer market, there has therefore been less incentive for software developers to support other environments, even Mac OS in many cases. It just isn't very commercially viable for them. This is exactly why many programs are less likely to be available on Mac, and even less so on Linux systems. This also, in a funny way, makes Linux safer. It's the same reason that Macs don't get viruses. It's not because they are just magically immune to them. There have actually been several instances of Mac viruses throughout history. It's because Mac's market share is so low that making viruses for the platform just isn't worth it. And there's much less people using Linux as a consumer system, and those who do use it are the type of people to often know a virus when they see one and take the necessary precautions. But wait, couldn't people just go the GNU route and make similar free alternatives to popular commercial programs? Yes, and they most certainly have. Microsoft Office is LibreOffice. Photoshop is GIMP or Inkscape. QuickTime is VLC, and so on. Many of these alternatives are even just as good, sometimes even better, than the paid versions. For example, my laptop broke while making this video. While it was being fixed, I had to use my backup computer to work on my script. And this computer does not have a Microsoft Office license on it. So I had to use LibreOffice instead, and it worked perfectly. And further cemented just how wrong I was with my initial convictions for Linux and the software it typically supports. Again, exposure and familiarity is a huge part in what makes the commercial programs so popular. But what about the World Wide Web? That was also a free and public project, and it became very popular. Why wasn't there a Windows equivalent of the World Wide Web that took over? Well, companies did try that with something called walled gardens, and it just didn't work. It also turns out that it takes a lot less work to get on the World Wide Web from your computer than it does to install an entirely new operating system. It goes all the way back to convenience, time, and ease of use. But also, there isn't always a free Linux version of these popular programs, and if there is, they often aren't as good, and the ones that are often have very different interfaces with big learning curves. A big example of this is Adobe. One of the biggest reasons that I initially did not like Linux was because of what I thought was very little support for programs involving video editing and graphic design. There are currently no Adobe products within the Creative Cloud that support Linux. The thing is, there aren't exactly very good free Linux alternatives either. The closest thing is the Photoshop alternatives that we just mentioned, and even more recent ones like Photopea are pretty dang good replacements if you're doing more base level stuff. But for programs like Premiere and After Effects, it gets a bit more tricky. There are certainly free Linux versions that are arguably just as sophisticated and capable, but they have totally different interfaces and environments. In many respects, It's like learning a whole new language. And more similar free programs like DaVinci Resolve are also not officially supported on Linux. Now, I understand that Adobe has become quite a contentious subject for people over the past few years, particularly because of how expensive it's gotten. Having said that, I've also been using it pretty much every day for over 15 years now. It's all I know. And if you're stubborn like me and don't want to take the time to learn something new, then Linux may not be the right fit for you. Unless these programs I'm familiar with finally provide Linux support, I personally don't see myself using it as a daily consumer system. I'm more of a Mac guy anyway. But if you do want to learn something new, not only would I say that Linux could be right for you, I would even encourage using it. And that's kind of what Linux's primary demographic is. Linux is not trying to hold your hand when you use it. Yes, there are distros like Ubuntu that are designed to be user-friendly, basically combining the likeness of Windows and Mac together, but there is a sort of unspoken expectation with Linux that you already know what you're doing. Most people like familiarity and learning things easily and quickly, which is why Windows and Mac have a strong consumer lead over Linux. But for the people who do know what they're doing, it's the exact opposite. It is almost exclusively the system they use. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, around 90% of servers and mainframes run Linux, and for web servers specifically, that number is 96%. When you understand the system from head to toe, are intimidated by new things, and are patient enough to take on a challenge, the cost effectiveness, stability, safety, hardware flexibility, and customization of Linux makes it a no-brainer or even dream choice, which is often the case for people who manage servers. Now that I run my own media server at home, I just love how customizable everything is, both in software and hardware. And because of how many people are making changes to it, I love how well documented things are whenever I run into any problems and need to troubleshoot. In that context, I could not see myself living without it. And some commercial software developers have indeed become aware of this as well. Operating systems like Chrome OS and Android are modified versions of Linux, at least modified enough to where they become proprietary again. Despite its rather invisible presence on the surface, Linux now runs as the very backbone of our technological world. Not even just our world. It is even present on the International Space Station and on Mars. And it all started with one guy at a desk in his bedroom. It connects all of us everywhere, often in ways we aren't even aware of. A true manifestation of the kind of open, freely accessible tech domain that the project envisioned all those years ago. Now, we could talk about Linux all day, evaluating its strengths and weaknesses. But what good is that if you don't actually try it for yourself? Early bird gathers no moss, rolling stone catches the worm. Time is ticking. And I don't mean UNIX time, if you catch my drift. I'm talking about all the valuable time you could spend learning through Brilliant. It is a program that turns the miracles of portable devices into an educational, even life-changing experience that can be done anywhere in the world. Who would have thought that learning could be so easy and fun? Whether you want to improve a skill you already have or learn something for the very first time, Brilliant allows you to do it at your own pace and through real-life application. It does this by allowing you to problem solve through critical thinking based on the topics you're currently learning. And Brilliant has an entire category just dedicated to programming, ranging from Python to developing intuition for computer logic. I like to think of programming as the bridge to Linux. Because your mother is so promiscuous. If she were a Linux file system, her permissions would be 777 because everyone has full access. Start your relationship with Linux today by programming with Brilliant. Go to brilliant.org/nationsquid or scan the QR code to get 20% off your annual subscription, which gives you unlimited access to all Brilliant content. If you want to learn more about operating systems or Unix in general, you can check out my video about Mac versus PC right here. A special thanks to my Patreon supporters. Check out patreon.com/nationsquid to get access to exclusive content. You can always buy me a coffee as well, or Java, as the tech people say. Thanks for watching, everyone.